Hey guys, and welcome back to the FFP. My name is Christian, and today we got another awesome video going over everything you need to know for Week 16 start-sit research that we have done for you guys. Now, I always tell you, there are timestamps down in the description below so you can see when I'm talking about which games, and there's a comment section for a reason. Ask any questions or say anything that you'd like. Heck, even tell me how wrong I am. I always say that every week, but really just say anything that you want, and I'll do my best to read all your guys' comments and respond, as well as I've seen a lot of people responding to each other's comments, just going back and forth talking. I love that. Love to build that community of just people where everyone's bouncing feedback and ideas off of each other. That's a lot of fun, especially at this point in the season when, really any advice is welcomed, right? But let's not waste any more time, guys, and let's just get into it with our first game this week. And one of the things to remember is that there's no Thursday game this week, but there's 3 Saturday games, so that is something to remember. You have more time to set your lineup, and you don't have to worry about injuries for Thursday games. If they're questionable, it's not quite such a short turnaround. However, guys, do remember that you're going to have to set your lineups Friday night or Saturday or whatever, so don't forget that. For our first game, guys, we're going to talk about the Texans versus the Buccaneers. There's quite a bit of fantasy potential here. A lot of guys who are all over the place, inconsistent, but have huge upside. The first one being Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson is a must start. Not only do the Buccaneers give up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but over the last 4 games, Watson's been great. Over the last 4 games, he's had at least 18.9 fantasy points in every game, and that's despite playing the Colts, the Patriots, the Broncos, and the Texans, which are far from the worst pass defenses in the NFL. In fact, 3 of them are, I would call, good pass defenses, and then the Colts probably average, a little below average. But for me, he's a must start. He's second in quarterback fantasy scoring so far this year. To me, it's pretty much a no-brainer at this point. As far as the running backs go, Duke Johnson is a must sit. He's got just 44 fantasy points since the bye. That's averaging 8.8 fantasy points per game in PPR, so you can take away the points for receptions there. That really hurts him. He does have 13 catches over the last 3 games. That's great, but that has clearly not saved his fantasy numbers, and in a standard league, of course, it gets even worse, so definitely sit Duke Johnson. As far as Carlos Hyde goes, there's some good and some bad. The good news being last game he had 26 carries for 104 yards and a touchdown, but he scored just 51 fantasy points since the bye. He's averaging just 10.2 fantasy points a game. That's not very good. I'm going to call that probably below average, especially in the championship game. At least in my league and PPR scoring, if a running back put up 10 points, I'd be a little disappointed. But the other thing being the Buccaneers give up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. In fact, get this, they have given up just 4 touchdowns to running backs in the last 8 games, and they have held running backs without touchdowns. They have held these running backs without touchdowns: Derrick Henry, Leonard Fournette, Alvin Kamara, Latavius Murray, and Chris Carson in the last 8 games have all been held without a touchdown versus the Buccaneers defense. So yeah, they're a pretty darn good run defense. And that does make me nervous for, a rushing attack, a ground game in the Texans is just not solid all the way around. If you can avoid it, I would not play Carlos Hyde this week, though some of you don't have the option. As always, that's what the comment section is for. DeAndre Hopkins is a must start, of course, especially considering the matchup. And he's a must start pretty much any week. But you throw in a great matchup versus the Bucs, giving up more fantasy points to opposing wide receivers than any other team. That's really a match made in heaven. He's a must play. Will Fuller, he's been really banged up lately, but in his last 4 full games, because he's played a lot of partial games due to injury, and you really got to scrap those. If he's healthy in this game, that's always something to monitor and check, but if he is, he plays great. His last 4 healthy games have been against the Falcons, Chiefs, Colts, and Titans, and he's averaging 7.5 catches, 115 yards, and 3/4 of a touchdown every game in those last 4 games. So he's been absolutely phenomenal, and as long as we don't see any signs of injury or issue with Will Fuller, he's definitely a guy to play, especially considering the Texans are a playoff team, so they are not going to be letting off of the gas pedal anytime soon. Darren Fells, he has just 8 catches in the last 6 games, and he only scored 1 touchdown. For me, that's really enough to just say sit him. He's got a lot of touchdowns on the year, but his touchdown production has slowed a lot lately, and he doesn't make up for it with catches or yards or just about anything else. Kymie Fairbairn, I would sit him. He's kicked just 4 field goals in the last 5 games, and he's averaging just 5 fantasy points a game over that span. So really just not getting enough production from him, at least from my perspective. He does have the opportunity this game where maybe the Texans go in and they blow out Tampa Bay, and he kicks lots of field goals and lots of extra points. But are you going to bet on that? Based on what I've seen the past few weeks, I'm not going to call that a very safe bet. I'd probably avoid it. Finally, for the Texans at least, we've got their defense sit for sure. They've scored just 11 fantasy points in the last 5 games, and in those 5 games, they've only forced 3 turnovers. Their defense is just not a very good defense, and it definitely has not equated to fantasy numbers. On the other side, we've got Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston's a guy you got to start. We've talked about this all year long where I've said, play Jameis Winston this week, play Jameis Winston this week. And everybody kind of shakes their head at me like, are you an idiot? Are you dumb? What's wrong with you? But really, in the end, guys, he's throwing touchdowns. I don't care how many picks he throws. I don't even care if you're in a league where you lose points for interceptions. You lose, maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 at the most points for an interception. Okay, but he also can go out there and throw you, 4 points for a touchdown. Some leagues are 6 points for a touchdown. So I definitely think it sets itself off or balances itself off the other way. I'm sorry, I'm struggling to speak here, and he's definitely the guy to go after. A guy to go after. Not going to be probably a top 6 quarterback for me, but he's coming in that 6 to 12 range, if that makes any sense. We've also got Ronald Jones Jr. For me, he's a low-end RB2 or flex play. He's had some good games this year, had some not-so-good games, but in the end, he is so far, at least at this point, he's the lead running back for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I've got some real pushback from a lot of people on that, but when you look back over, I can't remember if it's his last 5 or 6 games, he's been getting over 60% of the touches, and so that's definitely one of those stats that says, hey, it is pretty clear that they like him more. They're certainly willing to rest him, but they do like him more. Of course, Mike Evans and Chris Godwin are going to be out this game. I believe Chris Godwin is questionable, but guys, I really doubt he's going to play. Of course, monitor it. If Chris Godwin plays, then he's a must start. But other than that, again, I really don't expect him to. I expect both Evans and Godwin to be out. Rashad Perryman, this is a guy you got to play this week, especially if Chris Godwin is out. He's really capitalized lately. You go back to just 4 weeks ago, he had just 1 catch, but he's been productive. He turned that catch into 44 yards, and then since then he's really been turning it on. 5 catches for 87 yards, 3 catches for 70 yards and a touchdown. He had 5 catches for 113 yards and 3 touchdowns. It's crazy. This guy touches the ball 5 times, and he scores 3 touchdowns in that game. So Rashad Perryman, a definite start this week, especially if Godwin is out, he gets that real volume boost. The other guy I considered taking a look at was Scotty Miller. He did catch all 3 of his targets last week for 49 yards and a touchdown. Then he pulled a little bit of a hamstring issue, and he is currently questionable. Scotty Miller is a name that he's not a household name. I bet you that probably half of the people watching this video barely have heard his name before, if have heard his name before at all, which of course is just a sign. This guy's been buried on the depth chart down at the wide receiver 4 mark. And if he goes into the game with any nagging injury as a number 4 wideout who's only in there due to injury, I have a really hard time trusting him. So I'm going to avoid him this week, despite last week looking promising. As far as the tight ends go, we got Cameron Brate and Jordan Howard. Sit Brate for sure. He scored just 1 touchdown in the last 9 weeks. And it was a really weird one, actually. I was talking about somebody about this recently. It was a really short yardage situation, and he was lined up, it was like goal line, I believe, and he was lined up in the backfield, and he was, I believe, supposed to block, and then they audibled, and then he ran a route, and he happened to catch it. Great, but it clearly was not part of the scheming of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers or part of their plan. O.J. Howard is the guy. If you had to play one guy in that offense, it's O.J. Howard. I would call him a deep league play. He's still not a great tight end, but he does have... he does have 13 catches in the last 3 games, and he's had 61, 73, and 46 yards. Hasn't scored a touchdown in those games, but, maybe with those wide receivers out, Godwin's and Evans being out, maybe this comes into the week for him where he gets that volume boost and finds the end zone. I don't trust him, which is why I'm not going to consider him a really a top-tier tight end this week, because I just don't have complete faith in him, but he does have the upside, and especially in deep leagues or if you're desperate. Matt Gay this week is a fair start. If you remove 2 games in his last 8, so in his last 8 games, we're not going to count 2. If you remove those, he's been very good. So essentially in 2/3 of the games, he's been very good. The other 2, he's been bad, whatever. All in all, I like Matt Gay. I'd play him this week. And the Bucs defense, they've scored 56 fantasy points over the last 4 games. I would play them versus Houston in most leagues. You certainly might have a better defensive option this week, but also maybe you don't. In that case, definitely play them. They have been very effective recently. Now we come to the Patriots versus the Bills. Going to be a real fun divisional defensive battle. I'm kind of rooting for the Bills right now. I just love to see them shake up the NFL. Though I do love the Patriots, despite their cheating ways. It's just fun to watch a team kind of be like Darth Vader and the Empire from Star Wars, just win year after year. It's kind of like a running joke almost. But anyways, enough of that. Let's talk fantasy. And Josh Allen, to me, in small leagues is a must-sit. In large 16-team leagues, he's a must-start. And in regular size 12-team leagues, he's very much a borderline guy. It's a tough matchup versus the Patriots, but he's 6th in fantasy quarterback scoring. He's got 18 passing touchdowns, not very good, but he's got 9 rushing touchdowns on the year. I have a really tough time. I lean towards sitting him and finding another option because he's not going to do enough in a tough matchup against a good defense. He's not going to do enough in the passing game, so he's going to essentially have to run a touchdown in for him to have a fair fantasy day. For that reason, I lean away from him, but definitely in deep leagues, play him. Devin Singletary is averaging 13.5 fantasy points a game over the last 6 games. He's also got 15 targets, 11 catches, 69 yards, and a touchdown over the last 3. Now, the Patriots have allowed running backs to score just 2 touchdowns all season. For that reason, Devin Singletary, for me, was a little bit undersized. He's not going to be a guy who's going to get a boatload of goal line carries. I'm going to say sit him this week, and if you play him, I call him a medium flex play. But if you just have 2 running backs to start and no flex, then I would not play him this week. As far as the wide receivers go, John Brown and Cole Beasley is a tough matchup. The Patriots give up the fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Many of you know that Cole Beasley has shined in these games, but last week he just one catch for 60 yards. He does have 6 touchdowns in the last 8 games, but I definitely think there's a sense from defenses they're really starting to pick up on the Cole Beasley being a big part of this offense, and they're keying in on it more, and I don't expect him to do what he did last game in this game. And quite honestly, I expect this to be a real defensive battle and kind of I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of very ugly offense. For this reason, I consider both John Brown and Cole Beasley low-end wide receiver 3s, where if you're like me, I'm in a league where I've got Terry McLaurin, Kenny Golladay, Cooper Kupp. In that league, like there's no way neither of those guys are getting played. I've got some great wideouts. But if you are struggling, scraping for your final wide receiver this week, they can be played, but I don't love them. I hope that makes sense. And again, or maybe not again, I forgot to mention it, but and I say this every week, which is they have more value in PPR and standard slightly less, so I lean even further away from them in that. I would sit all Bills tight ends, and Steven Hauschka, I would start him in a game I'm expecting to be a defensive battle where they could probably kick a lot of field goals. I actually like Steven Hauschka this week, and I expect them to kick a lot of field goals. I could be wrong, but really, when I started doing some research on kickers this year, every kicker's a mess and you can't trust any of them. So honestly, it feels like at this point, any reason to start a kicker is a good enough reason. There have been 2 kickers all year I trust. But anyways, I would definitely play him this week. Could be a good week for him. The Bills defense, start them. They've got 20 sacks, 10 turnovers, and 55 fantasy points in the last 5 games. I'm going to have a lot of fun watching them go up against this Patriots offense. Like I said, should be a stud defensive battle. I'd sit Tom Brady. The Bills give up the fewest fantasy points to opposing QBs. They're a great defense, and I think a lot of people are even considering them the best defense in the NFL. As far as the running backs go, Sony Michel, I think you got to sit him. This is a guy who's really been lacking usage lately. He's averaging just 6 fantasy points over the last 6 games, and James White has stepped up as sort of the big guy, as sort of the number 1 running back in that offense. He's getting more usage in close games. In blowout games, Sony Michel gets more carries, sees more usage, and has more fantasy points, but the Patriots will not blow out the Bills this week. I'd be very shocked if they did. Coming now to James White, I think he's going to have a lot of catches this week. I think they're going to utilize him a ton. And over the last 3 games, he's got 45 touches, 249 yards, and 3 touchdowns with a yards per carry of over 5. So yeah, I'd probably play him this week as a low-end RB2, high-end RB3 in that sort of range, or definitely as a flex play in PPR. In standards, I bump him further down because he does get a lot of his points from being able to be used in the passing game. As far as the wide receivers, Julian Edelman is a must-start. Last week he had 2 catches for 9 yards. That stunk. That was bad. But when you look at all his previous games, he's been phenomenal. He has 8 catches for 110, 9 for 113, 7 for 47, 8 for 78, and 2 touchdowns, 10 for 89, 5 for 53, 8 for 93, 6 for 106 and a touchdown, 8 for 95 and a touchdown. And then, as I mentioned, in a blowout game versus the Bengals last week, he only sees 2 catches, but he beat the Bengals 34-13. Yeah, I mean, what do you expect? So yeah, absolutely start Julian Edelman. If we're being honest, you should sit all other Patriots wide receivers and Patriots tight ends. As far as Nick Folk goes, he's had 2 good games, 2 bad games. I lean towards playing him in a regular sized league, but I don't love him. You certainly may have better options. He's no Harrison Butker. And the Patriots defense, I'd start them. They have 7 touchdowns on the season. The Patriots defense has 7 touchdowns. Guys, that's crazy. That's more touchdowns than some people in the fantasy championships running back 2 have. I mean, they've been so productive. They've been so great. And again, going to have a lot of fun watching this defensive battle. But let's move on to our next game. We got the Rams versus 49ers, and Jimmy Garoppolo is the first guy to take a look at. The Rams defense has allowed 11 touchdowns in the past 10 games. That already is just about a touchdown a game, and that's pretty good defense. And then you consider they played the Rams one game, and Lamar Jackson had 5 touchdowns. So you take that game out, in their last 9 games, they have allowed 10 touchdowns. That is really good defense. I would absolutely consider sitting Jimmy Garoppolo this week, especially because he's been very inconsistent. When you look at his last few weeks, it's been start, sit. It's been all over the place. And they're a team that's been running heavily, leaning on their running game. And I think if they're going to win this game, a lot of it is going to come through the ground. I don't expect him to have a monster day. I think if they're going to win, it's definitely going to be through their defense and their running game. But speaking of the running backs, Raheem Mostert, I think you got to play him as a running back too this week. I really do. I know that makes some people nervous. And last week, somebody was commenting, are you stupid? The 49ers they're running back by committee. What's wrong with you? That's something that's really a trend that's begun to change. Raheem Mostert, the coaches have come out and called Raheem Mostert saying, we love this guy. He's been so productive. Kyle Shanahan said we need to get him the ball more. And sure enough, they have. He's got 5 touchdowns in the last 4 games. He's been leading the running backs for touches, and he's a guy who's consistently getting 15 to 20 touches a game. So yeah, I definitely like Raheem Mostert this week. I would sit Matt Breida and Tevin Coleman. I don't trust those guys when they're playing second fiddle to Raheem Mostert. As far as the wide receivers go, Emmanuel Sanders, in just 2 of his last 11 games has he been really fantasy startable. And in 8 of those games, he's had 4 catches or less. I would sit Emmanuel Sanders. I would consider playing Deebo Samuel if you're in a deep league. I don't love him in a lot of situations. Here's my concern. He had 2 great games, over 110 yards, and then he stepped down where the next 2 weeks he had just 2 catches in each game, but he had scored in those games. So, great for him. And then he had 5 catches for 76 yards. He had just 1 catch for 29 yards last week. So I feel like every week his volume has been shrinking a little bit. He hasn't, topped 100 yards in quite a few weeks. I feel like you're kind of gambling on him getting a touchdown because he's not a safe bet to get more than 4 or 5 catches. 4 or 5 catches is okay, but it's not great. And again, as we saw last week, he had just 1 catch off of 3 targets. So he makes me very nervous, but he's not unplayable in the right situation. George Kittle's a must start. He scored 86 fantasy points in the last 4 games. I believe that is best among all tight ends in the NFL. I really would be surprised if it wasn't. Absolutely start George Kittle. As far as their kicker, Robbie Goldgoals, he's got 6 field goals in the last 3 games. He's also kicking a lot of extra points in this offense that's scoring a lot of touchdowns. Gold is certainly a must start in my book. The 49ers defense, start these guys. Here's why. The last 3 weeks, they have not been good. They just struggled. The last 3 weeks have been tough, but they've played Atlanta, the New Orleans Saints, and the Baltimore Ravens, 3 great offenses, very great offenses. These are 3 teams that are very offensive-minded. They've got very good quarterbacks. They've got good wide receiving cores. The Ravens not so much, but man, they make up for it on the running game. I mean, all in all, they've been great. But before that, they scored 44 fantasy points in the previous 4 games. So before a really tough 3-game stretch, the 49ers defense was doing well. I think we could very well see the Rams struggle like they struggled last week versus the Cowboys. Now, talking about the Rams, we got Jared Goff. The 49ers defense have allowed quarterbacks to score 10 times in the last 3 games, he's averaging 2 touchdowns and over 300 yards in those last 3 games. Excuse me, that's what the 49ers have allowed in those last 3 games, is allowed quarterbacks to throw 2 touchdowns every game and at around 300 yards, I believe, averaging. And so it's tough for me. They, have allowed the 10th fewest, but recently they've played worse. But as I just mentioned, it's been some really good offenses. All in all, I don't trust Jared Goff. I would sit him this week. The guy I do trust is Todd Gurley. He's got 12 touchdowns on the year, and it's funny because he's actually been getting more usage lately and more touchdowns lately. He's actually got 4 touchdowns in the last 3 games. So yeah, Todd Gurley's not only been a very effective back, but he's been getting better as the year goes on. Excuse me. So absolutely play Todd Gurley. I know a lot of people coming into the season were nervous about his knee, but it's funny. You'd expect him to struggle as the season goes further on. If that were an issue, it's not an issue, and he's been getting better in the last few games as this offense, as the Rams have started to reinvent themselves a bit. And man, that has really helped him in the way that they've been recently running that offense. Cooper Kupp is a must start. He's 6th in fantasy scoring amongst wideouts. And the 49ers have actually allowed wide receivers to score 7 touchdowns in the last 5 games, so there's definitely a lot of room there for him. Robert Woods, he's another guy to play. He's got 37 catches in his last 5 games. He also has 95 plus yards in 4 of the last 5. He feels like a very safe play, especially in PPR leagues. Standard is definitely a different situation, though. I would sit Brandon Cooks, and you got to start Tyler Higbee. I don't know another tight end in the NFL who has got 3 straight games over 100 yards. And in those games, he's got 7 catches, and 12 catches. He's getting increased volume in targets in those games. Higbee is definitely a guy to play. You also got to start Greg Zuerlein. He's questionable, but if he plays, he's one of the best kickers in the NFL. Play him if he does, but again, he is questionable. And then sit the Rams defense this week. Now we got the Bengals versus the Dolphins this week. Let's start off with Ryan Fitzpatrick. It's funny, he scored 20 plus fantasy points in 5 of his last 9 games, and he scored 14 plus fantasy points in all 9 of those games. He has been actually a very productive fantasy quarterback over the last 9 weeks. And it scares me to say, but you should consider starting him. Now, I'll say this, if you've got Pat Mahomes or Lamar Jackson, obviously you're going to play those guys. But if you don't have a top 6 or a top 8 fantasy quarterback this week, then I'd begin considering plugging him in based off of your options. I mean, if you're going to put a guy in there like, say, Tom Brady, a guy who doesn't have a huge ceiling, or maybe you're thinking of Carson Wentz, a guy who's completely banged up without weapons and in a tough divisional matchup, then that's when you definitely begin to look towards a Ryan Fitzpatrick. And this is against the Bengals, who give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing QBs. Honestly, guys, straight, plain and simple, I'm going to sit all running backs, any guy that's running the ball for the Miami Dolphins. I would consider playing Devontae Parker. He's been electric, man. This guy's crazy. 2 catches last week. 3 weeks ago, he had 2 catches, 159 yards. He's been great, an absolute stud. He feels like every week he's a safe pick to get you 5 catches, 75 yards, and a touchdown. He's just been great. You must start this guy, at least as a wide receiver 3, but in my book, he is a high wide receiver 2. He really, really is. And it's funny, no matter how much defenses pay attention to him, he just plays fine. The volume keeps his stats up there, and he's got great chemistry with Fitzpatrick. I wouldn't start any other wide receivers there, though. You could consider starting tight end Mike Gesicki, though. He's 19th in fantasy points right now amongst tight ends, so that's pretty bad, and he's only got 2 touchdowns all year. He's going to get you about 3 or 4 catches and 50 yards a game. That's sort of been his MO as of lately. I don't absolutely love him, but if you're in a 16-team league and you're looking like you're going to win, and maybe you've got Evan Ingram at tight end, and you just need to plug a guy in to get you, 5 to 10 more points to just lock in that win. That's sort of the role to play Gesicki in, because he's a fairly safe play to get you those sort of numbers, but he's not going to really go off for a big day. And so unless you're, like I said, unless you're looking pretty already, I would consider a guy who's got more upside. I would sit Jason Sanders. I don't trust this offense right now. There's a lot to like about him. He did kick a ton of field goals just a couple of games ago, but that is a number I don't think he'll ever hit again. And again, I have some concerns. I definitely think there's some better kickers out there this week, though he is certainly playable. And as always, I would add this preface that in deep leagues, I would play him. The Dolphins defense, I would sit them as well. As far as the Bengals, let's talk about them. Dalton, Finley, any quarterback there, just sit them. This offense as a whole makes me very nervous. The guy to take a look at right now, running back Joe Mixon, he's been really turning it on lately. He's gone over 135 yards back-to-back games on the ground. Of course, that's been due to the fact that he's got 48 carries in the last 2 games. He's also got 2 touchdowns in the last 3 games. I mean, this guy feels like a safe bet. I feel like he's almost guaranteed to get you over 20 touches, and he may get you close to 30 touches. So yeah, for me, he's a running back 2 this week in a matchup against a defense giving up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So it's definitely also a very manageable week. Not the easiest game he's played in all year, but a fairly easy game. As far as the wide receivers go, the only guy to look at is Tyler Boyd. He's the only guy that I would consider starting. He is 24th in fantasy scoring amongst wideouts, and in this matchup versus a defense giving up the third most fantasy points to receivers, I would probably play Tyler Boyd. I would sit Eifert and Randy Bullock, and I would sit the Bengals defense. Now we got the Jets versus the Steelers, and Sam Darnold, you got to sit this guy. The Steelers, they give up the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, and since the bye, they haven't allowed a single quarterback to even hit 250 passing yards against them, coupled with the fact that it's Sam Darnold, and you already can't trust this guy. Le'Veon Bell. Now the Steelers have allowed just 2 running backs in the last 9 games, just 2 running backs in the last 9 games to score touchdowns. But they were both receiving touchdowns. So that is interesting. They haven't allowed a rushing touchdown in quite a while. He's got just 2 touchdowns in the last 8 games for him. I don't love Le'Veon Bell. And I want to tell a lot of people to sit him. I would consider sitting him. I really would. This is a tough matchup and a tough game. But I also know that if I say sit him, a lot of you guys are going to sit him and then say, why did you tell me to sit him? I played, Giovanni Bernard, and I lost my fantasy game because of you. Many of you will have to play him, but he is more of a, well, crap, this is not my best running back week. He is a low-end running back to low-end flex play, sort of a desperate play. But again, many of you are going to have to play him, and I want to preface that it purely depends on your situation, but I definitely lean towards sitting him. Now that we got that sort of uncomfortableness out of the way, the wide receivers to look at, Robbie Anderson and Jamison Crowder. Jamison Crowder struggled for quite a few weeks before bouncing back last week with 11 targets, 6 catches, 90 yards, and 2 touchdowns. However, when you look at the previous weeks, he struggled quite a bit, and for good reason. Those games were a lot closer. Sure, of course he saw 11 targets. You lost 42-21 against the Baltimore Ravens. So yeah, you saw a lot of targets, and you almost, and you only caught about half of them. Man, so I don't have a lot of faith in him, but it's weird. He had a good game last game, and then he struggles the 3 games before that. But then the 3 games before that, he was solid. 8 catches, 5 catches, 5 catches, 3 straight games with a touchdown. So he's like really good, terrible, good. I don't know what to make of this guy. There's certainly a lot of concern. He is playable this week as a wide receiver 3, though. A wide receiver 3 I'd call with high upside. He could very well have a huge day, and he could have a monster day and be a high wide receiver 2, low wide receiver 1. He could also kind of bust and go out and get you like what he did a couple weeks ago against the Bengals when he had just 2 catches for 8 yards. Robbie Anderson, similar situation. I like Robbie Anderson a little bit more, though. Because it wasn't just last week. Last week, he had 6 targets, 4 catches, 66 yards, and a 2-point conversion, whereas the previous weeks, he had actually seen more volume. The reason for this is last game versus Baltimore, he played against Marcus Peters, who is a phenomenal cornerback. But the games before, he had 7 catches, 117 yards, and a touchdown, 7 catches, 101 yards, 4 catches, 86 yards, and a touchdown. So yeah, he looked very good before that. I would play Robbie Anderson as a low-end wide receiver 2 this week. I'm going to sit all tight ends for the Jets. I'm going to sit their kicker, Sam Ficken, and the Jets defense this week. Now that we're on the Pittsburgh Steelers, Devlin Hodges playing quarterback. I wouldn't play him. He hasn't scored more than 1 touchdown pass all year. In a single game, he hasn't thrown more than 1. That is a major red flag, and I don't think that's going to change this week. So I would definitely sit Devlin Hodges. James Conner, I would consider playing him this week. Last week he had 8 carries for 42 yards on 5.3 yards per carry. He also caught 4 of his 5 targets. That goes very well for him. And he's got 6 touchdowns in his last 6 games. He's heading into this game healthy, and they're going to lean on him, of course. I believe they're, of course, playing for a playoff spot. And he is, now that he's been back, reminded us that when he is healthy, he is the guy. So yeah, James Conner, I'd probably play him this week as a mid to low end running back too. Juju Smith-Schuster, he's questionable. He hasn't played in 4 games, but he was a full participant in last week's practice, and it looks like he was back at least partially participating in practice at some point this week. We don't know the full details of it yet. That's what the Friday injury update video is for, which I will for sure be doing this week, guys. I promise I will be doing the injury update video. So make sure to look out for that on Friday. But like I said, we don't know right now whether or not he's going to be playing, but I expect that he will. James Washington's been great lately. When you look at it, he had 98 yards and a touchdown, 111 yards and a touchdown, 33 and 83 yards. He's been very good over the last 5-6 games. I would play James Washington this week as a wide receiver too. I would sit Vance McDonald and consider starting kicker Chris Boswell. And then finally the Steelers defense. I'd start them in 9 of their last 11 games. They have scored quite a few points. They've scored, I believe, over 10 points in all of those games. And they go against a team giving up the second most fantasy points to opposing defenses. But that's the Steelers versus Jets. Let's move on to our next game, guys. Guys, let's start this game off nice and simple by talking about the Giants quarterback situation, which is sit Daniel Jones, Eli Manning. I don't really care who plays this game. I don't trust either of them, and I'm not putting my championship on the line for either of them. So, yeah, I would sit them for sure. Barkley, he's definitely a guy you got to play. This offense has struggled severely and really held him back. But from what we saw last week, he's really starting to break through. He's kind of been Todd Gurley, so to speak. We all remember Todd Gurley's sophomore year where a bad offense held him back. But like I said, maybe last week is a real turning point for Barkley where he's saying, hey, I'm going to push through the bad offensive struggles. He had 29 touches for 143 yards and 2 touchdowns off a fair 4.3 yards per carry. And this is a good matchup against the Redskins, who actually give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So I would absolutely consider starting Barkley. No, I really think you need to start Barkley. I have a hard time imagining that you've got 2 running backs to play over him, so I'm going to say definitely start Barkley. I guess I will force a habit there. But as far as the wide receivers go, we got Darius Slayton. Slayton leads the team with 8 touchdowns on the year, but a lot of those came in the absence of Golden Tate and Sterling Shepard. And now that they're back, his role has been drastically reduced to just the deep route runner, just kind of the fly route guy. I would sit him this week, at least until we see that he is more than that when these guys are playing. Golden Tate, it's tough. He got a touchdown last week, and in fact, he's got, 4 touchdowns in the last 4 games. But he's also got 4 catches, 3 catches, 1 and 1. So it's like really hard to bet. Like last week, his 1 catch for 51 yards and a touchdown was great, but can you really bet on a guy to have a 51-yard touchdown every game? No, you can't. And the week before, his 1 touchdown equated to 11 yards, and that was it. It was just 2.1 fantasy points. So all in all, you can see why I'm probably going to lean towards sitting him this week against the Redskins. The guy I would consider starting is Sterling Shepard. Going into this year, we felt like he was the #1 guy. Concussions and injuries really held him back. Even when he played, he wasn't 100%. Sure enough, last week he led the team with 11 targets, 9 catches, and he played well. So all in all, I think he's starting to kind of come back into that role. Sterling Shepard is honestly, I believe, the #1 wide receiver as of right now. Again, he's really stunk this year. He hasn't been too great, but that's been due to injury, so there are some concerns there. But again, probably wide receiver 3 marker for him. That's probably where I'd put him. Evan Ingram is on the IR, so sit all tight ends. I would sit Aldrick Rosas and the Giants defense. With just 5 touchdowns in 8 games, Dwayne Haskins, you got to sit him. Darius Geis is on the IR, so I might consider playing Adrian Peterson this week. As always, I lean more towards playing Peterson in a standard league. But he's got 13, 20, and 16 carries. He's got 3 straight games with a touchdown. That's what his last few games have looked like. He's been fair. He hasn't been great, but he's a guy who's going to get you maybe up to 15. If he scores a touchdown, yeah, he could probably get you around 15 fantasy points, so he's not a bad play. Terry McLaurin, the way he's been playing lately, you have to play him. The Giants give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And he's got back-to-back games with a touchdown, and in those games, he's got 187 receiving yards and 9 catches. I'd sit all Redskins tight ends, and Dustin Hopkins, I would consider playing him in this game. I can see them kicking a lot of field goals. In fact, he's already been kicking a lot of field goals. Not a great kicker, but he's kicked 10 field goals in the last 4 games. And then I consider playing the Redskins defense. The last game versus the Giants, they forced 4 turnovers, and the Giants do give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. So I would consider that this week as a streamable play if you're looking for one to replace a defense that you've been using but don't like this week. We got the Panthers versus the Colts. I'm going to sit all Panthers quarterbacks. Here's what we know right now. Coach Perry Fewell said that he'll make the decision, I believe, Thursday. I can't remember exactly what it is. He talked about, still having to decide who is going to be the quarterback. But after throwing 3 picks in 3 drives, I don't care if Kyle Allen comes back as the starter. You're not going to trust this guy, and you're not going to trust his replacement. You're not really going to trust anybody in this situation. I don't care if it's Cam Newton. I don't care if it's Kyle Allen. I don't care if it's some guy from the grocery store. I mean, at this point, I'm just going to all in all say sit. The guy, of course, you got to play Christian McCaffrey. 87 rushing yards and 88 receiving yards last week and 2 touchdowns. That was 37 fantasy points. 37 fantasy points, and almost nobody cared because he does it every week. Everyone's like, oh yeah, it's another week for McCaffrey, whatever. You just, okay, great, another 37 fantasy points. That's awesome. But like, just, it's so funny. He's been phenomenal. Again, it's just crazy how great he is, and people we're so casual about this point. We've got short memories, and we just get so spoiled. But DJ Moore, you also got to consider playing him. He's been phenomenal. 101 yards, 121 yards, 120 yards, 95, 126, 75, 81, and 113. That has been his last 7 games. He's been a phenomenal wide receiver and quietly working himself into wide receiver 1 or, top 12 wide receiver fantasy potential, especially going into next year. Curtis Samuel's got 4 touchdowns in the last 7 games. He's a borderline play this week. I'm going to call him more of a high upside wide receiver 4. So I lean towards not playing him, but if you are looking to desperately fill in a standard league, that is a possible option. Greg Olsen hasn't scored since week 3. Start him in deep leagues, but nothing more. I would sit kicker Joey Sly. And the Panthers defense, in 6 of the last 8 games, they have scored 3 or less fantasy points. Quite obviously, I'm just going to spell it out for you. That means sit the Panthers defense this week. On the other side, we've got Jacoby Brissett. I would sit him. The Panthers give up the 11th fewest fantasy points to opposing QBs. And of course, you're going to start Marlon Mack. In fact, the Panthers surprisingly give up more fantasy points to opposing running backs than any other team in the NFL. So yeah, that's a great matchup. We get T.Y. Hilton. He struggled last week in his first game back, but he did see 9 targets, and I expect him to be healthier this week. He's also got 5 touchdowns in his first 5 games before really being derailed by injuries. Plus, the Panthers have allowed 4 touchdowns to wide receivers in the last 2 games. So all in all, yes, I would play T.Y. Hilton this week. Don't be too worried about his poor performance last week. Zach Pascal, 15 catches, 217 yards in the last 3 games. And again, the Panthers have given up 4 touchdowns in the last 2 games. All in all, though, I would still consider Zach Pascal a wide receiver 4. I'm going to lean towards not playing him. He's got huge upside, but there's so much risk involved. And again, looking with T.Y. Hilton back this week, all in all, I'm going to say probably don't play him. Jack Doyle, if you take out week 13, he's a guy who's only going to get you 3 or 4 catches and 30 to 40 yards. So sit him unless you're desperate and in a deep league with no good options, especially in a matchup against a team giving up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Finally, I would sit Colts kicker Adam Vinatieri's on the IR. I would sit his replacement, and I would sit the Colts defense. We got the Ravens versus the Browns. Guys, I love the Ravens right now because as my job as a fantasy dude is so simple. Lamar Jackson, Mark Ingram, Mark Andrews, Justin Tucker, and the Ravens defense, start them all. Boom! We just saved some time. Of course, they've all been phenomenal. 34 sacks, 22 turnovers, and 5 touchdowns on the season for the Ravens defense ain't too bad to go along with a record-breaking quarterback who has 40 combined touchdowns and a record for rushing yards by a quarterback. Mark Ingram's been great. Mark Andrews has been great. He's got 5 touchdowns in the last 6 games. This whole offense has been great. I love it. The one question mark, I would still say to start him, Marquez Brown. Some of you are going to be, like I mentioned earlier, you may have been in a situation like me where I've got Kenny Golladay, I've got Terry McLaurin, I've got Cooper Kupp, I've got Julian Edelman. I'm in a league where I've got all those guys, and I would sit him this week. I would sit Marquez Brown. But his 7 touchdowns on 43 catches is top 5 in the NFL for touchdowns per catch amongst wide receivers. So he's getting a very high scoring rate, and that's simply due to this unbelievably effective offense. Flipping sides now to the Browns, Baker Mayfield. He's thrown just 3 touchdowns and 4 interceptions in the last 3 games. This Ravens defense is looking very tough lately. Definitely sit him in this game. Nick Chubb, of course, is a must start, even in a tough matchup. He's gone over 100 yards rushing in 7 of 14 games. So he's pretty much a 50-50 bet to get you 100 yards on the ground alone. Again, tough matchup, but play him anyways. I would consider flexing Kareem Hunt this week in a PPR league. In my PPR league, he has scored 14, 11, 14, 17, 14, and 16 fantasy points. Again, a lot of those are really due to his ability to work in the passing game and getting those points for catches. But this could be a very good game for him when you consider that I think the Baltimore Ravens are going to put up points. They're going to score. I mean, it's going to be probably another awesome day for Lamar, who's probably going to have like another 5 touchdowns or whatever. And if that happens to be the case, which I expect it will be, they're going to be playing from behind. That should see some increased usage for Kareem Hunt, who's been effective recently. They're kind of the 2019 version of when Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara were on the same offense. As far as the wide receivers go, Odell Beckham, not huge. He scored just 2 touchdowns all year, and he's only scored 1 touchdown since week 3. He's good to get you about 4 or 5 catches and 60 to 70 yards. So he's a low-end play in PPRs. Other than that, I would tend to avoid him. Jarvis Landry's a must-start, though. Yeah, he struggled last week, 5 catches for just 23 yards versus Arizona. That was a really weird week for him. But other than that, he's really been great. 51 yards and a touchdown, 97 yards and a touchdown, 43 yards and a touchdown, 10 catches, 148 yards and 2 touchdowns, 6 catches, 76 yards, and 4 catches, 76 yards. So yeah, over his last 6 or 7 games, he's been great. He has 1 off game. I understand that, but other than that, he's been fine. I would sit all Browns tight ends and sit Austin Seibert. I really don't think the Browns can afford to win this game off field goals, so I don't see them attempting too many field goals in this game, and I would sit the Browns defense. Now we got the Falcons versus the Jaguars, and let's start off with Matt Ryan, who's a quarterback you should probably start this week. 9 times he's gone over 300 yards passing, and he's got a good matchup against the Jaguars defense that has looked increasingly poor over the last few weeks. Also like Devonta Freeman. The Jaguars give it the 4th most fantasy points to opposing running backs, and in fact, they have allowed 141 fantasy points in just the last 4 games to opposing running backs. That means that's an average of 35 a game. Now granted, some of those points come from running back 2s who happen to get carry here or there, but Devonta Freeman is the guy, meaning he'll get, probably at least 60 to 75% of those fantasy points, and 60 to 75% of 35 fantasy points, all in all, seems like a good day for me, so I would play Devonta Freeman this week. And of course, must start Julio Jones. It's crazy. He had 20 targets last week. I mean, talk about volume. It's really hard to argue with those numbers and with his quarterback. Calvin Ridley is on the IR, so I would play him. I would sit Russell Gage as his replacement this week. I just don't think he's going to do enough. I would tend to look elsewhere for some better options. Austin Hooper's a must start. He is 6th in fantasy scoring among tight ends. 6th. And he missed 3 games. That's crazy to me. That just shows you how effective he has been. Quietly one of, if not the best fantasy tight end in football right now. I would start Younghoe Koo. He's been kicking really well. He scored 11 plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 6 games. So he's had some pretty solid starts recently. I would definitely play him. And in the Falcons defense, I'd start them. They've actually forced 12 turnovers in the last 5 games. And the way this Jaguars offense is looking, they could very well probably be missing DJ Chark with some really inconsistent quarterback play. Another day with 3 or 4 turnovers doesn't seem unreasonable for that defense. So I would play the Falcons. Flipping sides now to the Jaguars, we got Gardner Minshew. In 5 of the last 6 games, quarterbacks versus Atlanta have thrown 1 touchdown pass or less. That Atlanta defense has really begun to work some kinks out and is currently, at the beginning of the year, they were if you would have asked me, 5 weeks into the year, I would have said they're the worst defense in the NFL. Now they're certainly not the worst, and they made a lot of improvements, far from a great defense. But again, 5 of the last 6 games, they've allowed opposing quarterbacks to throw just 1 or 0 touchdown passes. So yeah, I'm going to sit Gardner Minshew. You got to start Leonard Fournette. This guy's got 26 catches over the past 4 games. That is 2nd among all running backs in the NFL. So even in the game where the Falcons could possibly blow them out, Fournette keeps himself in there as a big part of the offense, getting some fantasy points, and with that solid PPR boost. DJ Chark is questionable, as I said before. I'm probably going to say, or I probably assume that he's out. I think he's not going to be playing this week. But of course, monitor it if DJ Chark plays. You do want to start him. I just don't expect him to. If he is out, D.D. Westbrook is a guy to look at. There's a good matchup against the Falcons, a team that scores points, but certainly this year as a whole has struggled on defense. And when you look at it, his 29 catches on 40 targets since week 7 is 5th among wide receivers in catch percentage with a catch percentage of, I believe, 72.5%. That is. So he's been pretty darn effective. Last game, not his best game, 2 catches for 14 yards, but he had a few solid games before that. And again, if Chark is out, he's a safe bet to get you, 4 to 8 catches in that range, and that's pretty nice. I would probably sit Chris Conley and all Jaguars tight ends. I'd also sit Josh Lambo for me, guys, I'm going to call him a low-end start. You can start him, but I don't love him. I love him. He's a good kicker, but I don't love him with this offense at the moment, and that's my concern. And finally, I would sit the Jaguars defense this week. We got the Saints versus the Titans. Drew Brees, he's a must start. Congratulations on the touchdown record to Drew Brees. He has been absolutely phenomenal, and his 650 yards and 9 touchdowns over just the last 2 games have been absolutely insane. Drew Brees, he's a must play this week for sure. In fact, he has a pass rating of 128.3 over his past 4 games. Man, he's been so effective. Alvin Kamara, now the Titans have allowed 8 touchdowns to opposing running backs in the last 6 games. So if there were ever a game for Alvin Kamara to get back on track, this would probably be it. He's averaging almost 7 catches a game over the last 7 games, Alvin Kamara is. So for me in PPRs, he is a must start still. Again, it's a good matchup, and he gets, again, I have to remind people this, you get 6 points for a touchdown. So every 6 catches is a touchdown. That's essentially what you're getting, and you have to evaluate the stats in that way. I would play Alvin Kamara for sure, unless you're one of those few people. I played somebody last week in fantasy who had both Derrick Henry and Christian McCaffrey. Unless you're that guy, play Alvin Kamara. Michael Thomas is also a must start. He's gone over 100 yards 9 times this year. He's absolutely phenomenal. Could very well break Marvin Harrison's reception record. Kind of hope he does. That would be certainly fun to see. Absolutely play him. We got Jared Cook as well. Excuse me, I'm very short of breath right now. I also got a sore throat. I've got some hot chocolate over here. But anyways, we got Jared Cook against a team allowing the 8th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. And he doesn't get a lot of catches, but the catches he does make, he makes the most of them. And he's seen more targets in production since Drew Brees has returned, so both of those bode well for him. His 11 receptions, so 11 times this year he has had receptions of 20 yards or more. And that's over just the past 8 games. That is second among all tight ends. He is one of those big playmakers who stretches the field. He's fun to watch. He's a big part of that offense, and he is certainly a guy to start this week. Will Lutz is also a must start. He's kicked 31 field goals this year, and he has been absolutely phenomenal. One of those few guys that I would trust to play in my lineup almost every week at the kicker position, which seems really ugly and messy this year. Finally, the Saints, I'd start their defense as well versus the Titans this week. We got the Titans now, Ryan Tannehill. I would consider playing him. The Saints give up the 14th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and he scored 21 fantasy points in 7 of his last 8 games. You also have to start Derrick Henry and even A.J. Brown. It's crazy. A.J. Brown in 3 of his last 4 games has scored a touchdown and gone over 110 yards. He's been phenomenal. You got to play him. Delaney Walker's on the IR, leaving Jonnu Smith a possible start. Over the last 2 games, he has scored 11.9 and 17.7 fantasy points because he's gotten 8 catches in those games and just about 90 yards and a touchdown. Finally, I would sit Ryan Suckup and the Titans defense. The Titans defense is a good defense, but the Saints allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing defenses. So I don't imagine that's a day where they're going to force a lot of turnovers or put up too many points. We got the Chargers versus the Raiders now. Starting off the Chargers, sit Phillip Rivers. What I do want to talk about is the running backs, though. Melvin Gordon and Austin Eckler are quite honestly both running backs you should play this week. I feel weird saying that, but you should. It's a good matchup against the Raiders. They give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing backs. And they've given up 4 touchdowns to running backs in the last 3 games. So all in all, that's a good day. Melvin Gordon should be started because he has scored 12 plus fantasy points in 8 straight games. And Austin Eckler should be started because he is 3rd in fantasy scoring among running backs in PPR leagues. Guys, in PPR leagues, he is the 3rd highest running back in scoring. That's crazy. And of course, he's averaging 63.7 receiving yards a game. So I would play both of them. It's one of those weird offenses where they somehow manage to both get the job done and put up their points. You also got to play Keenan Allen. He caught 20 of his last 22 targets. That's a 90% catch rate. He's a must play. Mike Williams has been great the last 3 games, really turned it on. It's a good matchup. He's got 117 yards 3 games ago, and then back-to-back games with a touchdown after that. I would play him as well. And Hunter Henry, he had an off week last week versus the Vikings, but really the entire offense really sucked against that Vikings defense, and I believe they had, 7 turnovers by the Chargers, so of course he really struggled in that game. Don't overthink it. I would probably play Hunter Henry this week. Michael Badgley, for me, he's a low-end start. He's had some very good games and some very bad. It's all about whether or not you're willing to risk it. You could find some safer options, but probably not going to find an option with more upside than him. The Chargers defense, they're averaging less than 3 points a game over the last 4 games, so I would sit them. Now we get to talk about the Raiders. Derek Carr, sit him. You should also sit Josh Jacobs, considering he is out this week. Of course, that's a big blow to a lot of people. Hopefully, you've got DeAndre Washington. DeAndre Washington had 14 carries for 53 yards, plus 6 catches for 43 yards, and a touchdown in the last game that Josh Jacobs was out. He also has 18 catches for 18 catches on 20 targets. That's 90% catch rate since week 8. That is the best among all qualifying running backs since week 8. So he's been very productive both running and pass, or both in the running and passing game. DeAndre Washington is the number 2 guy in that offense, so he will be getting the carries this game. Tyrell Williams, Hunter Renfrow, I'd sit both of them. Hunter Renfrow is questionable and may return, but with that broken rib or fractured rib issue that he has, even if he does come back, I don't trust him 100%. I don't trust him against this tough defense, and he's questionable, so he probably won't even play anyways. Same thing sort of goes for Tyrell Williams. He's not injured, but it is a tough matchup, and the Chargers defense has allowed 12.7 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receiving units since week 8. So since week 8, opposing receiving corpses, the entire team, all the wideouts, have combined for an average of 12.7. The league average is 21.9, so essentially 22. They're a very good pass defense. Darren Waller's a must start. The last 3 games for him have been great. 7 catches, 100 yards, 6 catches, 72 yards, and then 8 catches, 122 yards. That's some crazy high volume, crazy high production. I'd sit Daniel Carlson and the Raiders defense. They've scored a total of just 3 fantasy points over the last 4 games. Now we got the Broncos versus the Lions, and you know what, guys? Let's talk about Drew Lock, because I want to say a little bit, I told you so. Not a lot of people projected this. A lot of people were right with me. I was far from the only one, but sure enough, I went in that game after 2 good games from Lock and said, I don't trust him, and his 3rd game was pretty bad. Held to just 3 points versus the Chiefs. It took him 40 passing attempts to put together just 8 fantasy points. You can see why I don't trust Drew Lock. I know pretty much everybody agreed with me, but sure enough, we were all pretty much right in that, and I would tend to stand by that philosophy this week. Don't play him. As far as the running backs go, Royce Freeman, he's getting less touches than Lindsey. He's averaging just 3.5 yards from scrimmage since week 12. That is the 3rd lowest among the 45 qualifying running backs in that stat. So sit Royce Freeman. Philip Lindsay, though, is not much better. He has picked up first downs on just 11% of his carries. That is also 3rd lowest among qualifying running backs. He also has just 2 touchdowns in the last 8 games. And the one thing that he's known for being good at, catching the ball, he did 0 times last game in a game where they were blown out and held to just 3 points. They threw the ball and threw the ball and threw the ball 40 times, and Philip Lindsay couldn't catch a single one. I would sit both running backs in this game. I'd consider starting Cortland Sutton, though. Against the Lions, they allow the 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers, and he's been actually pretty good this year. Noah Fant is questionable with a shoulder. He was limited participant in Wednesday's practice. All in all, I would avoid Noah Fant this week. I'd also sit Brandon McManus, and honestly, I would sit the Broncos defense this week. That was the Lions defense. Reading my notes wrong here. I would consider starting the Broncos defense, and here's what I was finding. I looked into it. They're averaging 8 fantasy points a game over the last 5 games. That makes them a fair start with huge upside. In a game with a 3rd-string quarterback, David Blau, playing. They might have Bo Scarborough out. They've got Marvin Jones out, TJ Hawkinson out. They are so banged up on that offense, they could absolutely eat alive David Blau at quarterback. So, yeah, I would play the Broncos this week. My apology for the mishap, the misreading of my notes here. Matthew Stafford is finally on the IR, so we know for a fact he won't be playing. Definitely sit Blau. You guys knew that, though. And we've got Bo Scarborough now. He's starting with a rib injury, and he was limited in Wednesday's practice. All in all, sit him. Just sit any running backs. His replacement, Wes Hill, he scored 2 touchdowns last game. Great. His 10 carries saw just 21 yards. Just sit all of them. Marvin Jones is on the IR. TJ Hawkinson is on the IR. I'd sit Matt Prater. I'd sit the Lions defense. And the only guy that I would play is Kenny Galladay. Kenny Galladay is 9th in wide receiver scoring in PPR leagues, and he has 14 receptions for over 20 yards in the past 8 games. So he's a big playmaker. He's played really well even without Matthew Stafford. Kenny Galladay is the only Lions player I'd consider starting this week, because other than that, it's a bit of a dumpster fire right now when you throw in the crazy amount of injuries that they have sustained these last few weeks. We got Seahawks, Cardinals, and Kyler Murray. The Seahawks have 8 interceptions in the last 4 games. Their defense has played a lot better. In fact, they have not allowed a quarterback to throw 300 yards or more, or 2 touchdowns or more, or more than 2 touchdowns since their bye week. They played a lot better since then. I would sit Kyler Murray this week. Kenyon Drake, I'd sit him as well. When you come in his first game versus San Francisco, he scored 30 fantasy points. Last game, he scored 4 touchdowns. 4 touchdowns and 41 fantasy points. He was great. But in all those games in between there, he struggled. He scored less than 10 fantasy points in a lot of those games. He was very, very bad, and he wasn't great. He was getting volume in those games. In like one game, he had 13 carries, not just touches. He had some in the passing game. He had 13 carries. He really only managed it for 31 yards and 7 fantasy points. So I don't trust Kenyon Drake. I would sit him. David Johnson, sit him. He hasn't hit 21. He hasn't hit 20 rushing yards since all the way back in week 6. So it seems like a pretty safe situation to just sit that whole situation there. Christian Kirk is questionable and unlikely to play. He did not participate in practice Wednesday. Even if he is a limited participant on Thursday, it's very unlikely he'll be playing this week. If he is out, this makes Larry Fitzgerald a solid wide receiver 3 play, purely based off of volume in this matchup. I'd sit all Cardinals tight ends. I'd sit Zane Gonzalez in the Cardinals defense. Of course, you're going to start Russell Wilson. Cardinals give up more fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks than any defense in the NFL, and it's Russell freaking Wilson. This guy, oh man, I love this guy. He's been so phenomenal throughout pretty much every year in the NFL. It's just fun to watch him play, and he makes do. And of course, I like his 2 wide receivers, but we'll talk about that more in a second. With Rashad Penny on the IR, Chris Carson is a must start. 3 touchdowns or 3 rushing touchdowns in the last 3 games, and twice he's gone over 100 yards. Of course, with 24 carries last game, you can imagine why. You also have to like that volume, and this is another good matchup too. The Cardinals also give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Tyler Lockett's a guy to consider playing. He carries a lot of risk, as he did have in his last 4 games. He's had some real bad games, but he did bounce back last game where he had 8 catches for 120 yards and a touchdown. So I would probably play Tyler Lockett this week. Just understand you're accepting a little bit of risk. In case you didn't hear, Josh Gordon has gone bye-bye, and he is indefinitely suspended from the NFL for illegal drug use, performance-enhancing drugs, I believe it is. And of course, that's going to really help DK Metcalf be the guy. He's a guy who's a safe bet to get you probably 4, 5, or 6 catches in a game, and anywhere between 30 and 70 yards. He's a little bit inconsistent, but he's not terribly inconsistent, and I like him in this game. Jacob Hollister is nothing more than a deep league start at tight end. He's good to get you about 4 to 5 catches and 20 to 30 yards. Nothing phenomenal, but in a deep league, if you're desperate, he is okay. I just definitely lean away from it. I'm saying that a lot this week, and that's my way to stop, because I get a lot of complaints when I'll say, don't start this guy, and then they'll say, here are my options. Isn't he my best choice? And I'll go, well, yeah, actually, he is your best choice. And they'll go, so why'd you say sit him? And I'm like, well, because I don't know who your options are. So part of me is just trying to be a little diplomatic here and watch my words carefully. But moving on, Jason Myers, I would start him. And the Seattle Seahawks defense, I'd start them. This is a great matchup. And they've averaged almost 12 fantasy points a game over the last 5 games. So this could very well be an all-around solid day for the Seahawks. Should be fun to watch. Even these teams like the Seahawks, we're expecting them to win. They're expecting them to make playoffs. There's really no concerns. And a lot of people just sit back and say, oh, well, we'll wait and see what happens till the first playoff game. I like to watch them now and really start to see what I think of them now and begin making and formulating some predictions. In fact, I'd love to start hearing from you guys as to what you think is going to happen during this year's NFL playoffs and who's going to win the Super Bowl. I always have a lot of fun messing around running some different scenarios. But let's move on to our next game. Now we got the Cowboys versus the Eagles, and Dak Prescott, for me, he's a must start. He's 4th in fantasy quarterback scoring, and it's a great matchup against a bad pass defense. Ezekiel Elliott's another guy to start. back-to-back games with 2 touchdowns. They've really reformulated this offense around ground and pound, and Ezekiel Elliott once again being the guy. Good for him. He's a must start. And so is Amari Cooper, like I said, for Dak Prescott. Great matchup, good wide receiver, and great chemistry with this quarterback. It's all around, nothing to complain about there. Jason Witten is a fair play. He does have 2 touchdowns and a 2-point conversion in the last 3 games. And he's good to get you like 5 or 6 catches. So, in a PPR league, if he can get you 5 catches, 35 yards, and a touchdown, that's a pretty darn good day. So, yeah, I like Jason Witten. They're also playing Kaya Forbath as their kicker now, as they dropped Brett Maher, I believe 4 weeks ago now. But he scored 18 fantasy points last week, and I wouldn't be surprised if he did it again this week. But he is a bit of a risky pick, as he scored just 3 fantasy points in the previous 2 games. I'm going to advise you I would consider playing him. I really would. But take that with, just a little bit of understanding that there is some risk involved. However, most of your guys' kickers are probably only going to get you 5 points anyways, so you might as well gamble for the 18, I guess, Finally, the Cowboys defense, they're worth a shot versus a banged-up Eagles offense, and with all their weapons missing, you could definitely stream them this week. It's something to consider if you don't have one of those top 6 defenses. Carson Wentz, I would sit him. The Cowboys have allowed 9 touchdowns to quarterbacks in the last 3 games, yes, but I just don't trust this guy. You're going to put your fantasy championship in the hands of a guy who doesn't have his top 2 or 3 wide receivers? No way. I just don't believe that you should do that. I think that'd be too risky. Jordan Howard is questionable, has not played since week 9, still struggling with that shoulder. Coach Doug Marrone was talking about how it's kind of status quo, essentially, in some interviews. He was kind of alluding to the fact that it's not any better than it was before, so I wouldn't expect him to play this week. Miles Sanders is a guy to look at. Last game, his 37 fantasy points makes him very tempting, and his usage has been high. He's averaging 5.8 yards per touch, for scrimmage yards per touch. It's a sort of an obscure stat, but anyways, that is 3rd among the 34 qualifying running backs of this season as a whole. So he's been a very effective guy as far as when he gets the ball, he moves the ball down the field. And last week's 19 carries alone, let alone what he did in the passing game, shows his volume. A lot of people were concerned about how well Boston Scott played. That's not a major concern for me. Boston Scott's more of a guy in the passing game, doesn't do as much in the running game. And again, Sanders has just been so effective. I'd consider playing him as a mid running back 2 this week. Boston Scott, if you're desperate, you could gamble on him in a PPR. He does have 13 catches in the last 2 weeks, and he's gone over 100 receiving yards in the last 2 weeks. So he's been very good, but last week he only got you like 6 carries, right? And there's just a lot of concern with not enough volume there as a whole. He's got 1 touchdown, I believe. 1 touchdown in the last couple of games. I believe he's got 2 on the year. All in all, I don't trust Boston Scott. Don't play him, and I don't think he does enough to hurt Miles Sanders. However, he does make you a little nervous. He makes me a little nervous, and I wouldn't be surprised if you chose not to play Miles Sanders this week. Just make sure that you do have a stud to replace him. Zach Ertz, Dallas Goedert are both guys to start. Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz are safe bets to get you, 8 to 10 targets and 6 or 7 catches. It's hard to argue with that. And with all the wide receivers out on their team, it's really not that big of a stretch. Speaking of the wide receivers, the guy to consider this week is Greg Ward. Last week he had 9 targets, 7 catches, 61 yards, and a touchdown. The week before he saw 9 targets, 4 catches, and 34 yards. And then 4 weeks ago he had 6 catches for 4 yards. So he can be played as a wide receiver 3. This could very well be a blowout game in favor of Dallas. No offense to Eagles fans. I just think that it's pretty banged up offense right now. There's a lot of concerns. And if that happens, they'll be throwing the ball a lot. That could mean a lot of garbage time stats for Greg Ward. Finally, a borderline start sit is Jake Elliott, just depending on whether or not you've got some stud options. Great kicker, struggling offense, and I would sit the Eagles defense this week. Now we got the Bears versus the Chiefs, and Mitchell Trubisky, you got to sit him this week. The Chiefs defense has steadily improved throughout this year, and in fact the last 4 quarterbacks to face the Chiefs have combined for just 3 touchdowns. I don't trust Trubisky this week, and I don't think you should either. Now we got David Montgomery. I'd consider David Montgomery this week. He hasn't been phenomenal. I completely understand that. but as a mid to low end RB2 or a fair flex play, it seems fine to me. I mean, it's hard to argue with a guy who's getting 15 to 20 touches in a matchup against the Chiefs defense that have struggled against the run. I told you they've definitely been improving recently. A lot of that has been that they've been a much better pass defense than run defense. They give up the second most fantasy points to opposing backs. The Chiefs defense has allowed 5.8 yards from scrimmage per touch to opposing running backs. That is second in the NFL. Allen Robinson, I would play. In fact, I would play Allen Robinson and Anthony Miller. You look at the last 4 games for Robinson. It has been 30, 22, 21.8, and 25.5 fantasy points. He has been a stud, and he is a must start. Anthony Miller has been very similar, a little bit inconsistent, but look at his last 4 games. He's really stepped it up. 12.4, 13.7, 29, 13.2, and 28.8. I mean, last week's 15 targets and 9 catches for over 100 yards and a touchdown was phenomenal. I would definitely consider playing Anthony Miller this week. There is some risk involved, but I do like him, and I expect this to be a game where going late into the third, late into the fourth quarter, the Bears will still be throwing the ball quite a bit. I would sit all Bears tight ends and Eddie Pinheiro. He's a safe play, but he's not great. He's a safe play to get you a slightly below average amount of points. That's pretty much what you're getting with him, because the last 4 games, he has scored 6, 6, 7, and 7 fantasy points. So pretty much complete mediocrity minus a little, right? Just slightly below average. I would sit him for another kicker this week, and I would sit the Bears defense. We get the Chiefs now. Pat Mahomes, he's a must start. He is 7th in fantasy quarterback scoring despite missing 3 games. If you give him those 3 games, if he plays in those games, he is on pace that if he played in those games, I believe he'd be 4th or 5th in fantasy scoring. So yeah, you can see how productive he has been. And that's funny because that's even with the backfield struggling, and again, the injury, but also Tyreek Hill being hurt, Sammy Watkins missing some time. He's just a phenomenal quarterback. All the hype is on Lamar Jackson right now, and Lamar Jackson deserves the hype. But let's not forget about honestly, just how great Pat Mahomes is. He is fun to watch. I would sit all Chiefs running backs. It's a mess right now. It is absolutely horrendous. I don't want to go anywhere near it. Tyreek Hill is a must start. And for me, Sammy Watkins is a wide receiver 4. He hasn't scored since game 1. Week 1 in the NFL, hasn't scored since then. But it's tough. You'd think he'd do a lot better than that with Pat Mahomes, but he hasn't. And it's been long enough that we can safely assume this is just sort of where he's at. You have to start Travis Kelce and Harrison Butker. Kelce's a great tight end, you guys know that. And Harrison Butker is also a great kicker. He's been my kicker all year in multiple fantasy leagues, and it has been just a pleasure to not worry about my kicker every week. And finally, the Chiefs defense, I'd play them versus the Bears this week. They've scored 52 fantasy points in the last 4 games. They've had 9 turnovers and 9 sacks. I kind of like them in this game. I would not at all be surprised, and I'd kind of love to watch them just tear apart this Bears offense. And of course, the Chiefs defense is pretty good, but where do they get their advantage? In their offense. If they're able to get up early and force the Bears to be one-dimensional, that is going to help them a lot. But that's my wrap up for this game. Let's go to our final game of the week, guys, and then I can finally quit talking because my throat seriously hurts. Now we got the Vikings versus the Packers, and we'll start off with the Vikings and Kirk Cousins. He's had some real slow production recently, but they have won the last 2 games by 42 fantasy points, by 42 points. I always just throw the word fantasy in there, but again, they've won big lately, so of course his production is slow. That's really no surprise to see Kirk Cousins not having big days. Furthermore, the Packers allow the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but I think that number is very skewed. The last quarterbacks that they have been played have really been bad quarterbacks. Daniel Jones, Dwayne Haskins, Mitchell Trubisky. It's just one of those situations where they haven't played a lot of great quarterbacks, and this is going to be the best offense that they've played in quite a while. So it's going to be quite a test for the Packers. I would consider playing Kirk Cousins as a quarterback 8 to 12. Not one of those top-tier fantasy quarterbacks this week, but startable, worth a start. Dalvin Cook. I got a lot of flack in the waiver wire video for not talking about Boone as a waiver wire pickup at running back. I didn't tell anybody why I didn't talk about him. The reason for that being I had some really strong suspicions that even if he played, do you trust a guy who's got 21 touches on the season? You trust him in your fantasy game? No. But that was if Alexander Mattison and Dalvin Cook were out. And sure enough, Dalvin Cook will probably not be out this game. Here's what we know. He's marked as questionable, but Coach Mike Zimmer said, yeah, he feels good today. And when asked about his shoulder, he continued and said, he said, I don't think there was any issue with him. There were probably a couple of times we could have gotten him the ball more. That's what they said about him last game. A lot of people were concerned, but also when you won that game over the Chargers by that many points, I think they also pulled him out to be smart and to be safe. Adam Thielen, he caught 3 of his 3 targets for 27 yards last week. I would play him. It was a nice slow game back. He's 100% healthy, and they're going to use him to his full extent this week. I'd also consider playing Stephon Diggs. Look at the stat book. I don't even need to break it down. Just look at how he's played this year. He's been absolutely phenomenal. I would sit Kyle Rudolph. As I predicted, Kyle Rudolph's production was only boosted temporarily while Thielen was out. Thielen comes back and he sees just 3 targets last week. While some of that was due to the blowout game, I think also a lot of that was due to Thielen being back, and I don't love him. However, there's not a lot of tight ends out there, so for me, he comes in as a tight end range, probably 10 to 16. He squeaks in as a low-end starter in 12-team leagues, and a starter in deep leagues, but in small leagues, not so much. Dan Bailey, I would consider him. He's been a pretty good kicker this year, just hasn't kicked a lot. And this could be a game full of a lot of points. I wouldn't be surprised if this is a bit of a higher scoring game. I would play Dan Bailey this week. And really, Vikings defense, this is a tough one. I'm going to actually probably say start them. And this is a tough one for me because I want to root for them, but as a whole, I don't typically trust them. My concern, and I've said it a few times this year for the Vikings defense, is that they simply don't get enough turnovers. However, the last 3 games, they have forced 11 turnovers and scored 2 touchdowns. So maybe they've really turned over a new page, and they are this new turnover opportunistic defense. It's going to be a tough game versus the Packers. The Packers do not give up a lot of fantasy points to opposing defenses, but I would play them as a low-end play. Aaron Rodgers, I would sit them. Aaron Rodgers has just not been asked to do much other than Devontae Adams. He doesn't have a lot of weapons, and they play defense and run the ball. They're a very small ball sort of team, which I love to watch, but it's just not resulting in great fantasy numbers for Rodgers, so I would sit him. You got to start Aaron Jones. He is 4th in PPR scoring, and the Vikings defense is good, but I don't think they're good enough to do much more than slow him down. Devontae Adams, he's a must start for sure. I wouldn't start any other wide receivers for the Packers, though. I'd sit Jimmy Graham. Last game versus the Vikings, he was held without a catch, and I very well expect that trend to continue as he'll be lining up against some pretty solid linebackers. Mason Crosby, I'd sit him this week in the Packers defense. When you consider starting them this week, you should know this, that the Vikings have allowed the last 7 teams to score just 25 fantasy points. So the last 7 teams to play the Vikings, those defenses have averaged just 3.6 fantasy points per game. So I probably wouldn't play the Packers this week. And sure enough, guys, that is it for that game and the video. Whew.